this particular and unique crisis situation that we are living through as a country right now, not just the Trump presidency, but this situation with the president's illness and the lack of clarity and seemingly the lack of candor around the president's condition, I have to ask if you feel like there are national security implications of that we should be aware of or on the lookout for.
I think there are very serious national security implications. As you point out, I don't think the American people can have any confidence that what they're hearing right now about Donald Trump's health is accurate. Unfortunately, this administration has a very strong track record of deceit and dishonesty. And some of the confusion coming out as far as his medical status, I think, just adds to that uncertainty in terms of, do we have somebody in the Oval Office right now who can discharge the duties and responsibilities of the office of the presidency? Now, the 25th Amendment provides a process, a legal basis, in order to transfer power to a vice president if that person who in the Oval Office is unable to discharge those duties. But I don't believe that Donald Trump is going to relinquish them, even if he goes toward, a more serious illness and is incapacitated. And I think our adversaries around the world, whether it be Russia, China, or others, are they seeking to take advantage of this opportunity now when there clearly is distraction within the national security hierarchy, and that Donald Trump clearly is just focused on his medical condition and trying to present an image of being resilient. And we all hope that he recovers fully from this. We do. But I do think it is still quite uncertain, and it's quite disconcerting that we don't have confidence that what we hear from the highest levels of our government is indeed factual.
One of the unique and very interesting chapters in the book is sort of world tour that you give, where you talk about your interactions with world leaders and what your impressions were of them. And you get a sense about your training and also your experience reading people. Given that, I find it a little disturbing what you just said, that your read on President Trump is that even if he were quite severely incapacitated by illness, it's your impression of him that even in that circumstance, he might not relinquish power. That's a sobering assessment.
Yes. How does one determine that somebody is unable to discharge the duties of the office of the presidency? Again, the 25th Amendment provides a legal basis to do it. But I can see Donald Trump continuing to resist it, even if his mental acuity diminishes because of the illness or because of the treatment that he's being given in terms of the impact of the medicines that he's had. So I do believe that the intelligence collection systems of our adversaries are ramped up right now to try to get a better sense of exactly what's going on. And might the Chinese decide to do something, for example, in Hong Kong? Might Russia and Putin decide to do something in Belarus? Might other countries, again, try to take advantage of this time when there is this lack of coherence within the national security structure as far as what the condition and the abilities of the president of Donald Trump are? And so therefore, this is a time where I think it's incumbent on those senior officials in the White House to keep the members of Congress informed and to be as truthful and as forthcoming as possible about the ability of Donald Trump to carry out those duties or not.